Boldwood presents The Island of Hopes and Dreams, written by Kate Frost and read by Mirabel. Chapter 1. Clutching a bottle of rosé champagne to her chest, Lola Wild dragged her suitcase along the uneven paved path towards a wood-clad beach house. After feeling queasy from the train journey from Paddington, followed by 15 minutes in a taxi with a chatty driver, the Cornish air was a tonic and a reminder of carefree summers when she was a child. St. Ives had been a pain to get to on a Friday afternoon, but away from the town, she couldn't fault the location. Perched above a rocky bay and nestled between grassy hills, there was nothing else in sight besides the sea. Lola reached the bleached wood front door and paused. The light was fading, and the humidity of the mid-August day had been dispersed by the breeze rolling off the Atlantic Ocean. Animated chatter drifted towards her, and she assumed everyone was outside, gin and Prosecco flowing, as her friends made the most of the summer evening. She was the last to arrive. Her long and delayed journey had been broken up by the frequent updates popping into Mirabel's Hen Weekend WhatsApp chat. She'd seen the photos of her in Mirabel's room, and the rustic kitchen piled high with snacks and drinks, plus a selfie of everyone on a terrace, with just the glinting expanse of ocean behind them. All day she'd been longing for the journey to be over and to finally arrive. Yet now she was here, her nerves fluttered, and her heart stalled at the thought of being sociable, of pretending that she was okay. Holding it together was exhausting. Lola took a deep breath, put her game face on, and navigated her way round the side of the house, past a border packed with coastal grasses that sighed in the breeze. And then her senses were assaulted by raucous chatter, the mouth-watering aroma of burgers grilling over a fire pit, and Mirabel twirling on the terrace in a lemon-yellow midi dress, holding up a champagne glass. Lola forced her tired frown into a beaming smile, as first Mirabel, then the others clocked her, their chatter morphing into welcoming cries. "You finally made it!" Mirabel greeted her with a kiss, her smile as tender as her hug. She looked effortlessly cool, in oversized sunglasses and bare feet. Her long chestnut brown hair was enviably glossy, every bit the bride-to-be. With the hen do this weekend, and a leaving do at the end of the month before the epic Sardinian holiday and wedding in September, this was the beginning of the end. At least, that was how Lola felt about her best friend moving away. For Mirabel, it was the start of an exciting new chapter. Holding a bottle of Prosecco in the air, Denny was next to greet her with a cry of, "The party has officially started!" before she wrapped her arms around Lola. Entertainment lawyer Denny was usually straight-laced and serious in a smart trouser suit, so when she did let her hair down, she did it with abandon, and could be rather full-on. She was easy to bounce off, though, particularly when Lola wasn't feeling quite so bubbly. Lola was introduced to Mirabel's old school friend, Jenny, the only person she hadn't previously met, before Mirabel whisked her away to dump her luggage and swap the clothes she'd travelled in for a floaty summer dress. "Sorry you had such a hellish journey." Mirabel hooked her arm in Lola's as they strolled back through the beach house to join the others. "It was to be expected on a Friday. If it hadn't been for the album launch, I'd have headed down this morning with the rest of you." "It went okay, though." "Like a dream." Lola chuffed a laugh. "I might be all partied out, though. Those girls know how to have fun." Mirabel snorted. "They're the hottest pop band in the world right now. I would expect nothing less." They reached the living room. Sliding doors opened onto the terrace, and the glow from the fire pit flickered across the happy, drunken faces of their friends, who were silhouetted against the sunset wash of pink and orange and the rippled silver of the sea. "Won't you miss that side of things, all the socialising, when you're miles away in Sardinia?" It was a question Lola had thought of asking many times over the last few weeks, as Mirabel's wedding inched closer, and her time as a music agent at Rhythm was wrapping up. "Maybe. Probably." Mirabel sighed and tightened her grip on Lola's arm. "But let's not talk about stuff that's going to leave me an emotional mess. Tonight is about celebrating And spending time with my friends. She tugged Lola towards the joyful laughter on the terrace. And you need a drink. Lola was swept up by the merriment, but she was way behind on the drinking and felt on the periphery. That sense of detachment had constantly followed her in recent months. So many of her friends had moved on in their lives, whether through a career change, getting married, starting a family, buying a house or making a commitment to the person they loved. Mirabel getting married and moving away was a loss, and as heartbreaking as an actual breakup. Yet Lola was happy that her friend had found Fabs, her Italian husband-to-be, who was the nicest man ever, an all-round good guy with the looks to match. Mirabel finding happiness gave Lola hope that not everyone out there was a bastard, even if that was pretty much her experience of men and romance. Lola will be next to get married! At the sound of her name, Lola switched her focus from her thoughts, only to be confronted by 5 pairs of eyes. I'm the only one left who's not married, that's why, she said coolly before taking a swig of champagne. She glanced around. Mirabel, of course, was just weeks away from marrying the love of her life, while their mutual friend Polly, who they'd first met at a spin class, was happily married with 2 young children. In her early 40s, Denny, a colleague at Rhythm, was the eldest of the friends, married but child-free through choice. While Sarah, a close friend and neighbour of Mirabel's, who Lola had got to know well over the years, was married with 2 teenagers. Jenny was also married. Whether she was happy or not was another matter. All it did was showcase how far away, at the age of 32, Lola was from having a functioning, normal relationship, let alone a blissfully happy one. She raised her glass to her lips again. But getting hitched requires having a boyfriend first. I'm sure we can help with that, again, Denny said with glee. Yeah, because you all did so well the last time you set me up. Lola covered her discomfort with a laugh, but her insides churned at the memory of the last wedding she'd been to in May. One that had ended in disaster, knocking her already dented confidence when it came to men. Jenny leaned forward with wide eyes. Ooh, do tell, what happened? Lola shook her head as Denny and Sarah started to tell the story. With her cheeks getting hotter and hotter, Lola escaped inside to raid the fridge for a cold drink. She didn't want to relive the mortification of ending up in a situation she was never going to live down, particularly when it was still fresh in her mind. Fresh in Denny, Sarah, Polly and Mirabel's minds too, unfortunately. Nope, she didn't even want to think about it. Anyway, Sarah was saying, as Lola returned outside with a large glass of gin and tonic. It gave us all a laugh, even if Lola here missed out on hell of a night with the sexy groomsman. She turned to Lola as she sat back down. Although, to be honest, I was gutted when you split up with Yarek. I really thought you'd found the one. Lola gulped back a heady rush of distress and shifted in her seat. Mirabel met her eyes and gave a subtle nod, a soothing look that said, talking about him doesn't mean anything bad will happen. Because Mirabel had been the only person Lola had told the truth to about what had happened between her and Yarek. Actually, the semi-truth, because even Mirabel didn't know everything. There were some things Lola had kept to herself because they'd been too hard to talk about, as if saying them out loud made them more real than they had been, when she was still trying to understand how someone she believed had loved her could have behaved in such a destructive way. Although the silver lining is, Sarah continued, oblivious to Lola's distress, if you'd stayed with Yarek, then you'd never have got up close and personal with Dax, and we wouldn't have the best story ever to remind you about. For all eternity. Yeah, I get it, Lola said with a sigh. And oh my goodness, was Dax hot! Sarah wafted her hand in front of her face. So damn hot, Lola only went and sabotaged things by cooling the situation down in the most spectacular way. Denny reached across and squeezed Lola's knee. We promise we'll find you someone even better in Sardinia. Imagine all the sexy Italians we'll get to drool over and hook you up with. Right, Mirabel? Lola rolled her eyes and groaned, while inside she was squirming at the attention despite their good-natured teasing. Let them laugh, let them tease, let it not bother me, she thought. She'd taken one for the team, so to speak. A story that would undoubtedly be retold at every social get-together until someone else did something worthy of being gossiped about. So no, she didn't mind the teasing. She wasn't overly bothered that she made a fool of herself. But she was struggling with the attention so firmly focused on her love life, or rather her lack of one. They were living vicariously through her as the only single friend. Denny and Sarah in particular had their hearts set on finding her love, when that was the last thing she wanted. To try to get them to back off would invite the inevitable questions about why she didn't want to be matched with anyone, much less be in a relationship again. She was doing just fine on her own. Actually, that wasn't true at all. She may be happy being on her own, but she was hardly fine. Lola downed her gin and tonic and went inside to the bathroom, anxiety still swirling around her stomach. She rested her hands on the edge of the bronze sink and stared at herself in the mirror. The caramel tones running through her choppy blonde bob no longer made her face look quite so washed out, now the travel sickness had eased and the colour had returned to her cheeks. Laughter filtered in from outside, with Sarah's guttural snort overpowering the others. When they'd first met through Mirabel, she'd seemed quiet and mild-mannered, but she had a wickedly naughty side that was released at social events when an extrovert emerged. Lola ran her fingers through her hair to give it more volume and patted her hot cheeks with cool water. She tended to brush things off when she felt uncomfortable, instead of telling her friends to back off. What she needed to do was switch the focus back onto Mirabel. She would shrug off the teasing, forget about their promise of finding her a man, and just enjoy being together. Because she knew the truth. There was no perfect man for her, despite her friends all having found theirs. After a long, tiring and hot journey, it didn't get much better than sitting out on the deck of a beach house, a breeze rippling through the long grass, and the sun melting into a pool of burnished red and gold on the horizon. With good company, tasty burgers, and a bottomless supply of drinks, Lola finally relaxed. They had the whole weekend to enjoy each other's company, with a trip to Porthtowan planned for while swimming in its natural pool, then lunch at Blue Bar by the beach. The excitement for the upcoming wedding and the promise of adventure in Sardinia was at the forefront of their minds. Lola was relieved when the attention was finally off her and she could shrink into the shadows, quite literally when the sun disappeared. Only the glow from the fire pit and the string bulbs decorating the front of the beach house were left, casting warm light onto the wind-blasted wood. The arrival of darkness and nighttime insects was the cue for everyone to move inside, to lounge on the comfy chairs and sofas. The lamplight kept it cosy, while the breeze drifting off the ocean tempered the summer heat. After such a humid day, it was fortunate it wasn't raining, but it wouldn't have mattered because the house was cool and eclectic, with velvet sofas, a mix of white walls, exposed stone, and stripped wooden floors stained dark oak. It reminded Lola of a larger, more glamorous version of her loft apartment in London. She loved city living and a job that took her to cool places, but how incredible would it be to have somewhere like this, somewhere away from the rat race to share with friends, to relax and recharge. So, Mirabel. Clasping her champagne, Sarah leaned forward. Have you found a house for you and Fabs? Not yet, Mirabel sighed. We've been looking, but it's difficult only seeing a place online. It'll be easier when we're there, I'm sure. Moving to Sardinia had been something Mirabel and Fabs had talked about from the minute they'd become a serious item. But it was Fabs taking over the management of his family's business, with its portfolio of holiday villas and an award-winning vineyard and winery, that had instigated it. It's a dream move, Jenny said. Remember at school, sitting at the back of a physics class making plans for our future? I don't think yours included moving to Sardinia, but you definitely wanted to move away from Chorley Wood. You also wanted to marry Ryan Johnson. Thank goodness that didn't work out, Mirabel laughed. You couldn't have done much better than your Italian husband-to-be, Sarah said with a sigh. You already live a dream life, but starting your married life in Sardinia is the ultimate dream. Polly reached across and grabbed a handful of crisps from the bowl on the coffee table. I dream about not being woken up at 5 a.m. every single day, which is ironic considering how bad my sleep is. Jenny huffed. I just wish I could go to the bathroom on my own without being followed by a 2- and a 4-year-old. That's not too much to ask, surely. Oh, I hear you. Polly swallowed her mouthful of crisps. One day. Remember this when they're teenagers and no longer want to be in the same room as you, let alone actually talk to you. Sarah gave them a knowing look. I dream about the day we'll have an empty nest and the freedom to do all the things we put off because of the kids all being tied to school holidays. But at the same time, I know I'm going to bloody hate it when they're off to university, fending for themselves. And returning in the holidays with piles of washing and attitude. Denny raised her glass of champagne. And you wonder why I've never had kids. It sounds nice to be wanted, though, Lola cut in. She glanced at Sarah. Or even not wanted by your teenagers. Don't go putting Mirabel off when marriage and kids is next on her agenda. Mirabel slipped her bare feet beneath her on the sofa and gave Lola a soft smile. Marriage first? Find our new home and set up my business? That comes before kids. But it's true. I don't want to put off starting a family for too long. What about you, Lola? Polly asked. What's your dream? Secretly, Lola wanted her confidence back. She wanted to not feel constantly worried when she was finally free of a damaging relationship. But 8 months on from ending things with Yarrick, she still berated herself for having been so easily deceived. She wanted to learn to trust again, to be open to meeting someone new rather than terrified of the idea of opening up her heart. Finding her way back to who she used to be was what she dreamed about. Not that she was going to say any of that. I'd love to get a dog. She breathed in the warm ocean air and took in the freedom of being surrounded by green open space. The darkness beyond the open doors was vast, the clear night pitted with stars. She loved being by the sea, felt at home in a place away from real life and the reminders of a relationship she was desperate to forget, but couldn't. I longed for a dog growing up, but my parents never wanted the extra tie. Probably why they didn't want another child either. I was enough, but I was lonely and wanted company. So, a dog would be nice, but it's not exactly compatible with my life. I'd love to spend some time by the sea, maybe travel more. Really? Denny said. You already travel loads. Yeah, to some incredible places for work, for photo shoots and interviews, sure. Like Starlight's album launch last night. Mirabel raised her glass. But I'd like to have the chance to travel on my own terms, rather than in the guise of a PR manager, and only seeing the inside of the venue in my hotel room. Ah, you're young and single. Denny batted her hand. There's plenty of time for both of those things. What you should concentrate on is having fun, if you know what I mean. Lola refrained from rolling her eyes. Denny had her best interests at heart. All of her friends did. They just weren't aware that a man was not what would make her happy. Most of all, she wanted somewhere that felt like home. It used to be her apartment, until it had been infiltrated by Yarrick. It was hers, and she'd ended things with him, yet there were reminders everywhere. The safety and comfort of home was missing. It was a simple dream, yet one she didn't feel able to voice even to her friends. Lola looked pointedly at Denny, whose cheeks were flushed with drunkenness. What is it that you want? I want my husband back. Her easy smile disappeared. Everyone stilled. The upbeat pop track overpowered the pause in the conversation. Sarah glanced at the others, then turned back to Denny. Way to go to dampen the mood! What do you mean you want him back? Mirabel's tone was soft, and her frown matched the worry Lola felt. We're fine, but not fine, Denny shrugged, as if that explained everything. I love him, but we've drifted. Is he okay with you coming to Sardinia on your own? Mirabel asked. He's relieved I'm doing something other than working. And he'll be with me for the actual wedding, the important bit. Denny reached for Mirabel's hand. I need to work on us. I don't mean we have to do everything together, but we do need time that's meaningful. My dream is to get our relationship back to how it was 10 years ago, but there we go, such is life. She let go of Mirabel's hand and drained her champagne. But you're already living your dream, and it's only going to get better. Gone was the brief moment of seriousness, as they all raised their glasses with a cheer. Sarah busied about topping up everyone's drinks, and Mirabel cranked up the music. It was good to talk to her friends and open up a little bit, even if she didn't feel able to share everything. Lola's phone pinged. Out of habit, she immediately picked it up and clicked on the message before realising it was from a number she didn't recognise. "Enjoying the hen do? Cornwall in August must be delightful. I bet Sardinia in September will be even better." Dread shivered through her. She understood exactly who the message was from as she read it a second, then a third time. Innocent enough words that could be perceived as her ex just being nice, but she knew better, because this wasn't the first time since she'd left him that he'd contacted her. He was always careful to not write anything that could be deemed as confrontational or untoward. The reason the number was unknown was because she'd blocked him. Bar reporting him to the police, which she hadn't done because she didn't think she'd be taken seriously, she'd done what she could to remove him and his damaging influence from her life, and yet... Her stomach twisted as she reread the message, and her earlier anxiety returned with a vengeance. "They're just words, nothing more," she tried telling herself. Yet he knew where she was and where she'd be next month. However careful she was about what she put on social media, she couldn't control what her friends shared, and she had no idea who he was following, who he was stalking more like. Her heart raced. She tried to push down the fear and concentrate on the here and now. She was with her friends and safe. He just got a kick out of tormenting her because that was who he was. Mirabel was saying something, making a toast. Lola swiped off the message and forced her eyes from her phone to her friend. "Here's to love and happiness for everyone." Mirabel raised her glass and looked around, her gaze lingering on Lola. "And dreams coming true. Thank you, Lola and Denny, for organising this. Spending time with you all away from the madness of life in London means the world. I can't wait for you all to join me in Sardinia to celebrate Fabs and me getting married." She lifted her glass higher and her face lit up. "I'm getting married!" Lola desperately wanted to be happy. Yet being away with a wonderful group of women, celebrating the good things in life, managed to highlight all that was wrong with hers. At least Mirabel had found a man worthy of her. Fabs was as kind and loving as Yarek had been conniving and controlling. He didn't deserve a second more of her thought. Yet months after she'd left him, he was still managing to needle his way into her life. She shouldn't allow him to spoil this weekend. And yet somehow he already had. And she knew that had been his very intention. Chapter 2. Rhys Strickland didn't know if he was pleased that the stag do was taking place in Bristol, so he didn't have to travel, or disappointed that it wasn't happening somewhere further afield. He could have done with a weekend in Prague, Amsterdam or Dublin. Anywhere, really, besides the city he thought of as home for the last 15 years. It was a nod to their university days, and it made sense for it to be somewhere Fabs had lived for a chunk of time in his late teens and early 20s. They'd met in Freshers' Week, and had cemented their friendship with countless nights out. It was a long time since he'd been on a pub crawl up White Ladies Road, drinking to excess with his university mates, who'd scattered all over the place once they'd graduated. Whether they'd be able to recapture that optimism and don't-give-a-shit attitude of youth, he wasn't sure, but it would be good to try. Catching his reflection in the hallway mirror, Rhys paused. He hadn't known what to wear for a night out like this. A couple of drinks in the local pub with his new friendship group was his usual Friday evening. Well, this was a nod to the past, out with friends he hadn't seen in a long time. Yet his nerves were shredded because Zoe would be there, the token woman and his ex-girlfriend. She'd always been one of the lads, and as much a friend to Fabs as anyone else, so of course she'd been invited. It didn't mean he had to be happy about it. She'd have kicked up a fuss if she'd been left out. Plus, it wasn't Fabs's fault that things were awkward between them since she'd walked out of his life a year ago. He hadn't seen her since. He cast a critical eye over himself, somehow a stranger in new, slim-fitting dark grey trousers, a thin summer shirt and leather loafers. He'd worn socks, then taken them off because it was a hot and humid August day. Now he was wondering if he was trying too hard. To what? Look cool? to look younger than his 33 years, to look less like a primary school teacher and more like the sexy student he'd once been. Had he ever been that next to Fabs? He looked away from his reflection. He was being too hard on himself. He really was looking forward to a night out with his old friends. It was just his nerves were getting the better of him. His phone lit up. The Uber was outside. He'd have to do. Pocketing his phone, he grabbed his keys and left the house. The trouble with his ex being part of his friendship group was that while they'd both been invited to things over the past year, he'd found himself making an excuse if he knew she was going, leaving the way clear for her. Not that he thought Zoe would be bothered if he did show up. She'd seemed to have moved on from their relationship effortlessly. But then again, she was the one who'd fallen out of love and had abruptly left him. That was, if she'd ever truly been in love with him in the first place. His thoughts spiralled throughout the taxi journey from his house in Bishopston to the harbour side. By the time he was dropped off a short walk away from the bar, his heart was hammering and his palms sweating. The plan was to do a reverse pub crawl, yet the itinerary was a far more sophisticated evening than they'd ever had at the age of 18. Instead of starting off in upmarket Clifton and working their way down to a club in the centre, they would make their way up via a cocktail bar or two, have dinner at the Ivy, and end the night with a party at Barnaby's Clifton townhouse while his wife and daughter were away. Rhys stalled just before he reached No. 1 Harbourside, a bar they'd frequented as students and the only real nod to their university days. He didn't want to have to face big, confusing feelings, to be reminded of the past and a time when he was happy and carefree. Not joining them would be the easy option, yet he'd come this far. A group of lads jostled past, their drunken voices cutting over the smaller groups of giggling women dressed in tiny skirts and barely there tops. Rhys continued walking, following the flow of people, heading beneath the covered walkway lined with bars and restaurants. The sun glimmered on the water and everywhere was packed. The view to Perez Bridge, with its horn-shaped sculptures, and beyond the floating harbour was a familiar sight. He tried to tell himself that it would be like old times. Except it wasn't. Everything was different. He was different. The familiar faces of his university friends gathered round a couple of tables in the bar took him back to being 20 and loving life. Fab stuck out for being tall, dark, and easily the most handsome of the group. When girls had flocked to him in those first few weeks of university, the rest of them had all benefited by pulling the ones who weren't lucky enough to attract his attention. Although only a few months older than Rhys, Fabs had been more worldly wise, sophisticated, charming and wealthy. Not that he'd ever intentionally flaunted it, but his tastes had been far more refined than the average student's. He and Rhys were nothing alike, and yet they'd clicked and had become best mates, managing to maintain their friendship even when Fabs had moved to London. Fabs immediately eased Rhys's worry by enveloping him in a thumping hug, and then other friends were greeting him too. Rugby player turned personal trainer Freddie, who'd been in the same halls in the first year, lawyer Barnaby, who still lived in Bristol, and another guy Gareth, who he didn't know as well, but had been part of many a drunken night out as students. Unsurprisingly, Zoe was hanging back. Avoiding me, Rhys thought. He glimpsed her standing at another table in her low-cut red dress, the only woman in a sea of men. She'd left him for a quality assurance manager job in a large construction company in Birmingham, which, from talk among their friends, had skyrocketed her career. He should be pleased for her, but the way she'd gone about undoing their life still hurt. He acknowledged her with a polite nod, and she returned a tight smile. He didn't owe her any more than that. As a student, he'd happily ridden the wave of youth, relishing the freedom of escaping a small Welsh town and living it up in a city. At least that was how he remembered it. Overthinking things had increased with age, to his detriment. Precisely how he'd wound himself up into a ball of anxiety about tonight, when he should enjoy being out with friends he rarely saw, and not let Zoe bother him. Drinks were consumed down on the harbour side, before they moved to a cocktail bar on Park Street. By the time they'd walked to the White Lion in Clifton and settled on one side of the expansive terrace, with views of the Clifton Suspension Bridge and the River Avon meandering through the Avon Gorge below, Rhys's remaining uneasiness had been erased by beer, friends, and plenty of reminiscing. It's been too long since I've been in Bristol. Fabs threw his arms across Rhys and Barnaby's shoulders. I miss you guys. Perhaps we should make this a yearly get-together. And not let so much time pass between seeing each other, Barnaby added. I'm in. Me too. Rhys clamped his hand on Fabs' shoulder. Might be harder to plan once you're married and living back in Sardinia, though. I'm sure Mirabel will be happy to come back to the UK as often as we can. Yes, for you two to see her friends and family, Barnaby stressed. I'll be able to escape for a couple of days. She's laid back like that. It was true. Fabs and Mirabel seemed to be the perfect match, both with striking looks, which made for an enviably beautiful couple, but they also worked effortlessly as a partnership and were friends as well as lovers. Mirabel was as successful in her career as a talent agent as Fabs was as a sales manager in the finance industry. He'd needed someone who knew her own mind and equalled him in confidence and independence. Until a year ago, Rhys had been content with his career choice and having his own house that he'd grafted for. However, he couldn't really say he was happy. There'd been moments of happiness, but sharing his life with someone and having a happy, loving relationship seemed out of his grasp. A bout of depression after Zoe had left had been the catalyst for making a change. It took all of his effort to be upbeat for his classroom of children, something that felt impossible to maintain outside of work, which was why taking a sabbatical had been necessary. Going to Sardinia for his best friend's wedding would be the perfect way to start off in a positive way. He didn't have time to mull over things any further, not when Fabs bought another round of drinks, and he and Barnaby rejoined some of the others at a table. Rhys sipped his lager and was content to listen, enjoying the gentler heat as the sun slid to the horizon, the river below a silvery ribbon as it snaked through the tree-clad gorge. Freddie returned from the bar and chose the empty seat next to Rhys. His eyes shifted between him and his pint, and he looked downright nervous, which was strange when he was usually so ballsy, loud and a good laugh. He always had been. When they were students, he'd effortlessly stolen all the attention, even alongside Fabs, in a way that endeared people to him. Freddie swigged his beer and cleared his throat. Not really had a chance to talk to you yet this evening. He set his pint down, rolled up his t-shirt sleeves, and clasped his hands round his biceps, which were toned from his daily workouts in the gym as a PT. Apart from Fabs and Zoe, Rhys knew Freddie better than anyone, which was why his frown and obvious discomfort was out of character. Freddie looked down. But I didn't want you to hear it from anyone else. But me and Zoe, we're, together. Rhys's heart stilled. Together? As in, you're going out with each other? He managed to utter. Since when? Just a few months. A few months? Rhys's grip tightened on his bottle of lager. And you're only telling me now? No wonder Zoe had kept her distance. How did you even get together? We don't live far from each other now, so we met up for drinks a few times. Things progressed, he shrugged. I know it's a bit weird that she's your ex and all, but it's been a year since you guys split. We all good? That was it. That was going to be the extent of the conversation. We're together, have been for a while, hope you're okay with it. Rhys wanted to rage and yell and tell him in no uncertain terms that of course it wasn't all right that his friend and his ex were together. But instead he found himself saying lamely, Yeah, of course, why wouldn't we be? Freddie patted his shoulder. That's a relief. I've been shitting myself all evening, getting the nerve to tell you. You want another drink? At Rhys's shake of the head, Freddie gave him another friendly thump on the shoulder and strode off towards the outside bar. The friends surrounding Rhys became a blur, the conversations loud and muddled. He only caught snatches of words as his mind raced, Freddie's blow having hit him harder than an actual punch to the gut. He needed to get away to clear his head and sort through the tangle of emotions. The terrace was still bathed in sunshine, and people were everywhere, making the most of the hot, dry August evening. Clutching his lager bottle, Rhys wound his way towards the inside bar. Rhys-ta! Gareth said, as they nearly collided into each other in the doorway. He flashed Rhys a grin, and with his arms did a Smithy's Gavlar moment from Gavin and Stacey. "Feels like old time tonight, fucking ace!" "Yeah," he said, trying to push past. Gareth gripped his shoulder. Beer sloshed around his nearly empty pint glass. "You realise I'm only across the bridge in Cardiff?" Gareth's eyelids were droopy, his heavily Welsh-accented words slurred. The few times they'd gone out together at uni, he'd always been a heavy drinker, and slightly obnoxious with it. Perhaps little had changed, although Rhys didn't know him well enough for that to be a fair judgment. "Isn't your family in Wales?" Gareth continued. "Yeah, Mum and Dad are in Caerphilly." "We should go out. You, me, Barnaby, Freddie and Zoe too, since she's moved in with him. Worcester's not too far. Maybe we could do a whole weekend." Rhys's insides clenched. "He just told me they were together, but he didn't say anything about them living together." Gareth raised his eyebrows. "Yup. I'm surprised as fuck it took them this long to get together." Rhys frowned. "What do you mean?" "Wasn't it common knowledge they had a thing for each other at uni?" Gareth said. "They were the definition of friends with benefits." The chatter from outside faded away as Rhys focused on Gareth. His heart beat faster and sweat beaded his top lip as the words played over. "Me and Zoe were together at uni," Rhys said slowly, "during most of our first and second year, before she did her year abroad." "Were you? I did not realise that." Gareth slapped him on the shoulder. "Maybe I got it wrong then." He lifted his nearly empty pint glass. "Need another drink?" He shot off, making a beeline for the crowded outside bar before Rhys could answer. Rhys stepped into the pub and drained his lager. It left a bitter taste on his tongue. What did Gareth know? They'd had separate social circles while at university, and had been on different courses and in different halls of residence, although they'd known each other through Fabs, which meant he would have known Zoe then as well. What if there was truth to what he said? Rhys and Zoe hadn't survived her going abroad, although they'd remained friends, and by the time she returned to Bristol for her final year of her degree, Rhys had changed his mind about pursuing a career in law and had started a teacher training course with a placement teaching English in Tuscany. Rhys put his empty bottle on a table and navigated his way through the bar to the toilets. He shut himself in a cubicle. 8 years after he'd graduated and they'd gone their separate ways, he and Zoe had reconnected romantically and had stayed together for more than 3 years, with her eventually moving in with him back in Bristol. He'd never once had an inkling that she'd been unfaithful to him during that time. But when they'd been at university... The thump-thump of pop music played over the speaker in the men's toilets. Rhys put the toilet lid down and sat with his head in his hands. Those anxious thoughts that had kept him company on the taxi ride once again returned with horrible clarity. Only a few weeks before Zoe had announced she was leaving him for a new job in another city, Rhys had been looking at engagement rings. They'd lived together, and he'd loved her. Yet sometimes he'd questioned if they were right for each other, when they seemed to want different things. Gareth might just have proved that Rhys's gut instinct had been right. Not that it made him feel any better. Chapter 3. Rhys's fear about revisiting the past and spending time with his friends and Zoe had come true, albeit in a way he hadn't anticipated. They moved on from the pub terrace to the Ivy, a restaurant housed in an impressive Georgian building in chic Clifton Village, where Freddie and Zoe sat next to each other, their easy intimacy making Rhys wonder how their relationship hadn't been obvious before. When they reached Barnaby's house, it was much harder to avoid them. And even more obvious how Zoe and Freddie radiated towards each other. It shouldn't matter when he and Zoe were no longer an item, but she'd broken his heart, had seemingly cheated on him when they'd first been together at uni, and was now with one of his friends. Had everyone else known? Rhys tried to force down his resentment as a beer was handed to him and the music was turned up. Almost everyone was gathered on the ground floor of the Georgian townhouse, where the front living room seamlessly transitioned into the kitchen, and the patio doors were thrown open onto the terraced garden. Barnaby had done incredibly well for himself, with a house that had to be worth 7 figures. Its sash windows, stripped floorboards and dado rails working beautifully with the modern touches. They must have spent a fortune on builders to renovate it, managing to get the place livable in a fraction of the time it had taken Rhys to finish his 3-bedroom Victorian terrace. He shouldn't compare himself to Barnaby, not when it would only make him feel even worse about himself. So Rhys went through the motions of pretending he was having a good time. Easy enough to do with copious amounts of alcohol. He drifted between people, chatting absent-mindedly while nursing a beer, making a concerted effort to chat with Fab's London friends, who didn't know anything about him and his past relationships. But despite his intentions not to let the truth about Freddie and Zoe get the better of him, Rhys kept catching a sight of them. He couldn't tear his eyes away, noticing the way Zoe would laugh at something Freddie said, and how she'd throw her head back in a full, throaty chuckle. His eyes were drawn to the milky skin of her throat and down to her cleavage, which was pushed up in that little red dress, and the way her hand brushed Freddie's arm, his solid, muscled, gym-honed arm. A fire burned in his core, intent on flaring up and joining forces with that little jabbing voice in his head that made him want to spit and shout and scream, to release all those feelings of hurt and worthlessness that had been building in the years since Zoe had left. What he needed was closure, which Zoe, being with someone else, should have given him, but not when she'd moved on with his friend. Seeing them so comfortable and perfect together made him question everything. Particularly their student years and the lies she must have spun. The fact that Freddie, one of his closest friends, had been complicit felt like a huge betrayal. A juddering thought slammed into him. Had Fabs known about Freddie and Zoe back then too? Tuning out of the conversation about London politics, Rhys swivelled, feeling dizzy as he searched for Fabs, but there was no sign of him. And it was difficult to make out who was chatting together in the fairy light lit garden. He did spot Zoe extracting herself from beneath Freddie's arm and heading towards the kitchen. With his sights on Freddie, Rhys made his move. Gripping the neck of his beer bottle and fueled by alcohol and adrenaline, he closed the distance between them. Freddie noticed him too late to move away, and Rhys nearly stumbled into him. "Are you two going to Sardinia together?" he blurted out, inwardly grimacing that he sounded like a petulant child. Freddie looked at him warily. "Yeah, that's why I wanted to give you a heads up earlier." "Out of the goodness of your heart, I suppose," Rhys said, unable to stop the sarcasm in his voice. "Well, yeah." "What the hell's with the tone, mate?" Freddie shuffled uncomfortably. "I know this is a bit of a weird situation, what with you being Zoe's ex and all, but—" "A weird situation?" Rhys spat back. "You know I was in love with her." The second the words were out of his mouth, he regretted them, because of the pitying look Freddie gave him. Freddie was everything he wasn't. Bolder, fitter, bigger, funnier, more confident. The list went on and on. Of course Zoe would wind up with someone like him. Acutely aware of everyone else in the room, and realising that the music wasn't quite loud enough to overpower the conversation, Rhys tried to control his anger. Out of the corner of his eye, he spied Zoe hanging back in the kitchen, watching. He lowered his voice and tried to backtrack. "It's fine to be with her now, but when we were together at uni, Gareth told me." Freddie's eyes widened. "We fooled around a bit." He shrugged as if it was nothing. "I honestly didn't think you two were that serious." Rhys saw red. Freddie was spewing lies. All 19-year-old Rhys had talked about when he'd first been with Zoe was how wonderful she was. Freddie would have been an idiot to have not known how hard Rhys had fallen for her, and yet he'd happily fooled around with her, while she'd obviously cared so little for him that she'd slept with one of his mates behind his back. Rhys slammed his bottle on the marble mantelpiece and launched himself at Freddie. Rage thrummed through him as he put his full weight into the punch. His fist connected with Freddie's cheek with a satisfying smack, splitting his lip and sending blood spraying. Pain ricocheted up Rhys's arm, and his knuckles burned as he stumbled back. There were shouts of, "What the hell?" as he charged back towards Freddie, still with a desperate desire to smash his fist over and over into his smugly handsome face. Zoe was screaming at him to stop. Someone grabbed his arms and wrestled him away. Zoe flashed him a look of loathing before rushing over to Freddie, who was cradling one side of his face. Rhys struggled against the firm hands holding him back. Hot tears blurred his vision, while rage still smouldered in his heart. Friends rushed around Freddie and Zoe, casting looks of disappointment and downright disbelief. "Rhys! Rhys!" It was Fabs who was gripping his shoulders as he herded him out of the room. In the quiet of the hallway, Rhys caught the worry on his friend's face, mixed with a touch of pity. Rhys's heart dropped. Not only had he made a fool of himself, but he'd made a scene at his best friend's stag do by allowing those lingering feelings for Zoe to get the better of him. "I'm okay. I'm calm." He dropped his gaze from Fabs and wrenched himself away from his grip. "Did you know, though, about them being together when they were at uni?" Fabs sighed and beckoned him into the room on the opposite side of the hallway. Rhys reluctantly followed and stood his ground in the middle of Barnaby's book-lined study. Fabs perched on the armchair next to the fireplace. "I had my suspicions. I'm sorry, Rhys. Obviously they were both invited to the wedding, but until Freddie said they only needed one room, I hadn't realized they were together. I wanted to tell you, but Freddie asked me not to. He said he wanted to tell you himself. I just didn't realize he was going to wait until tonight." He folded his arms. "I should have said something. I knew how much you liked her." "And now I know how little she thought about me." His head swam with regret as much as drunkenness. "I'm sorry for causing a scene." "You don't have to apologize for that." Fabs adjusted his Rolex and stood up, looking at him firmly. "Zoe and Freddie are friends, but you're my best friend, Rhys. If anyone's to blame, it's them for telling you about their relationship at the worst possible time. I absolutely should have said something about them being together now and my suspicions about them when we were at uni." Rhys grunted. "It wouldn't have made a difference. I was besotted with Zoe at 19. I'd probably have hated you for telling me something I would have refused to believe." "Well, for what it's worth, I'm sorry for not speaking up." Fabs clapped his hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Rhys nodded, despite feeling as if his emotions had been dissected. "I'm gonna go home. Not sure I want to face everyone right now." Rhys never liked getting back to an empty house, but as he staggered in that night, chased by a feeling of shame and leftover rage, he hated it. The whole situation was a mess, and he was annoyed with himself for the way he'd handled it, making a spectacle of himself while coming across as the bad guy because of his reaction. He stood in the dark, quiet hallway. He'd love to get a dog, but knew it wouldn't be fair when he was out 5 days a week working a long school day. What was the point if he had to get someone else to take them for a walk and keep them company? His sabbatical was only temporary, and in a year's time he'd be back to the grind. Not that he felt that way about his job necessarily. It was just how he felt about everything right now, going through the motions of life listlessly, like he was drifting with no clear direction, no idea of what he wanted or how he really felt. That was why he needed some time out. Being snappy and stressed with his classroom of kids wasn't fair on them, and had left him with so much guilt he decided drastic action was needed. But tonight, drowning his sorrows had definitely not been a good idea, and the truth about Freddie and Zoe had knocked him sideways. Why had Zoe rekindled their relationship years later, only to wind up with Freddie? He should be relieved that he was no longer with her. He'd put in all the effort, and for what? For her to have played him for years, for her to have lied to him from the very start. She and Freddie had just proved that he was better off without her. Why, then, did he feel incapable of finding or deserving love? Chapter 4. On an overcast day in mid-September, 4 weeks after the hen weekend, Lola put her out-of-office on and shut down her laptop. Less than an hour later, she was on her way to Heathrow. She loved her job, but bar the hen weekend in Cornwall and a fleeting visit to her parents over Easter, she hadn't taken time off all year. Surrounded by music and interesting people on a daily basis, the distraction of work had been positive, and she jumped at every opportunity to get away from London. The thought of a 10-day holiday to Sardinia, culminating in Mirabel's wedding, was incredibly appealing. Lola knew how much planning had gone into the wedding, because it was pretty much all Mirabel had talked about for the last year. Not that she blamed her. If she was getting hitched to a kind and wonderful man like Fabs, then she wouldn't stop talking about it either. although she'd also seen Mirabel's stress levels increasing over the last few months. The hen do had been the last time she'd actually seen her relax before they'd returned to London, and Mirabel had frantically wrapped things up at work and handed over to her successor, ending a whole chapter of her life, something which had added yet more worry, anticipation, and nervousness to an already emotional time. Jittery nerves started fooling about in Lola's stomach the moment the plane touched down, with the lightest of bumps, on the tarmac at Olbia Costa Smeralda Airport. Even with Denny next to her, it didn't stop the worry gnawing away that she was about to spend a large chunk of time with a whole load of Babs and Mirabel's friends and family that she didn't know. There was excitement too. Denny's own excitement was off the scale. For a workaholic, she was fully embracing this time away in Sardinia. And, until her equally workaholic husband joined them for the wedding, Lola was enjoying having her friend to herself. "I've needed this so badly," Denny said, when they were in a taxi heading up the Costa Smeralda coast towards the guest villa, which was located across the bay from where Fab's family lived, in luxurious Porto Rotondo, with its celebrity mansions and stylish marina. "I think you do too." "Need what?" "Some downtime to recharge. De-stress. You were quieter than usual on the hen weekend. Is everything okay?" "Just tired, that's all, and in desperate need of a holiday." They fell silent, Denny obviously understanding.